Please be seated. It always begins in darkness. Creation emerges out of darkness. In the beginning, when God began to create, the earth was welter and waste and darkness over the deep. Creation begins in darkness. Incarnation begins in darkness. The darkness of the womb, the gestating divine baby held safely in the womb of the one who said yes. The child birthed in a shadowy stable who grows to adulthood in the shadows of empire, a gentle flicker of light in the darkness. That tiny spark that awakens something in us, and once awakened, like shepherds and magi, we are drawn to that holy child through the night, through the dark, by the light of a star. Like Nicodemus, we come to Jesus at night, our minds darkened with questions and confusion. Like Lazarus, Jesus calls us from the darkness of our tombs, and we emerge stumbling over stones of cultural expectation and still bound in the cloth of old hurts and self-protection, squinting into the brightness of the divine light, the light that shines in the dark, the word that is spoken into the silence. Darkness and word at creation. Darkness and yes at incarnation. Darkness and do not be afraid at resurrection. Today it is not the darkness of the womb, but the darkness of the tomb which unfolds us. The women venture out in the dark, in the pre-dawn, and with whatever little light they have, we make our way with them to the tomb, only to find another darkness, another void, another silence. But this time it is not a bleakness that hovers over the void, not a darkness or a silence, but a light, a blinding light, like lightning, and a voice shattering the silence, do not be afraid. It always begins in darkness. And our world seems perpetually dark at times. It often feels like we can't escape the darkness that surrounds us. But Holy Week reminds us that while we can't escape it, we can be transformed by going through it. Every year, our Holy Week liturgies take us on a transforming path through the darkness, through the void, the abyss, to the other side, to the Easter side. From the confounding ritual of foot washing on Thursday, we descend quickly into the shadows of betrayal and denial, and then to the shock of execution and death on Friday. And then on Saturday night, we gather, often shivering and cold, and always in the gathering dark, around a fire that we very often have real trouble lighting. But somehow we always manage to light one candle, and then another, and another. And by the light of these few sparks, we tell the story again. The story of the light that shines in the darkness, and the darkness does not overcome it. Now, every year these stories vary slightly. This year we told stories of God's power and our vulnerability. We heard God speaking out of a whirlwind and asking, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth, or shut in the sea with doors when it burst from the womb?" And we had to admit that when all of that happened, we were nowhere, still part of the void. We heard the story of a great climate catastrophe, a flood, and how God repented of harming the earth because of humanity's malfeasance. And again, we were reminded of our vulnerability. We sang a song of praise as we watched God protect Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego when they refused to bow down and worship false idols. We stood amazed as God gathered a field of dry bones, reassembled them, put flesh on them, and breathed life into them. And we stood on a precipice with a churning sea, the primeval void in front, and a conquering army bearing down behind, and surrounded by forces that we could neither escape nor control. What did we do on that precipice? We complained. We despaired. We cried out, "Why, God? Why us?" As we sat in the dark, candles flickering, telling these stories, we were reminded over and over again of God's eternal faithfulness, of God's inexplicable grace, of God's ineffable power to make a way out of no way, to brighten the darkness, to speak comfort into the deafening silence, to anoint with healing balm, and above all, to transform death and defeat into life and peace. Now, I'm sure I am not the only one who is profoundly aware of how dark our world continues to be. The long shadows of empire and oppression still fall upon far too many of us. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who feels really vulnerable a lot of the time, who feels that everything is somehow more precarious and more out of our very limited power to control. And so this year for me, Holy Week became a really powerful reminder that it always begins in darkness. Creation, incarnation, resurrection, God's work always begins in darkness. And that with God, the cold darkness of the tomb can be transformed into the warm darkness of the womb. That vulnerability is very often our greatest strength, and that very little of the world is really in our control. Creation happens because God wills it, with very little input from us. Incarnation happens because God wills it, and only one or two of us needs to say yes. Resurrection happens because God wills it, and it doesn't really matter whether we are ready for it or not, or if we can even understand it. So even if we are vulnerable and on a precipice in the gathering darkness, I pray that we let this Holy Week and Easter be a reminder to us that, to sort of quote the late Bishop Barbara C. Harris, that the God who is behind you and beside you and always, always with you, that God is more powerful than anything that is in front of you. Let us hold on to that today and into the coming 50 days of Easter. And then let us go courageously into that light of the future that God is holding out for us. Amen.